I'm so tired. I have to do an intro for this video. I have two segments, painting, representing 2 hours of work, and I'm excited for the second segment because I'm doing time lapse. For the third segment, I'm talking a little bit about Richard Schmid, his Alla Prima II book, and I think I might be starting a series where I talk about each chapter as I read it again. That section has the first half of the first chapter. That's what I have to offer. I'm regretting the thick underpainting because I've done thick underpaintings before and didn't like having to paint on top of them. It was fun doing the thick underpainting, and I think I got a little carried away. Also, I have an abstract I did a while ago with really thick paint, and I was looking at it again, realizing that I do like it after all. So that was my frame of mind when I did the underpainting. The first thing I did was finish the underpainting. This time I used my brush instead of the palette knife, and I thinned the paint with mineral spirits. It will be interesting, as the process progresses, to see what underpainting thickness I will prefer working on. I'm guessing it will be the area with the mineral spirits, not only because the paint is thinner, but because it will dry faster. I tried to fix the face, but I think it's still wanting compared to before the incident from the last video. I did a few more tweaks on the face, and I think it's starting to look a little bit closer to before I messed it up. I also started adding in the lightest petals in the hair, trying to get the color right. So not the underpainting, the final strokes of paint. I used cadmium red and white, and I liked the look of that for the lightest petals. But I realized that in adding more cadmium red with less white and even a little blue to get it darker, I wasn't getting the other color of the petals quite right. Let's see, how can I show you this? So here are the lightest color of petals, and here is the color that I got to replicate it using only white and cadmium red. But now I want to get these petals that are a little bit darker. The problem is that when I add red to my mix, the cadmium red, it's too yellow. So what I need is alizarin crimson, which is a bluer red to work with. Finishing the flowers in her hair, I was able to use alizarin crimson mixed with some of the mud that I had earlier for the other flowers. This gave me the color that I wanted for the other petals of her hair. I tried to mix a black to work into the middles of the flowers and the edges of the petals, but I wasn't able to get as dark as I would have liked. I'll have to work on this when I do the darker areas coming back in later. For my first 20 minutes, I'm just painting in some darker hair. It's pretty straightforward. I mixed ultramarine blue with just a smidgen of burnt umber to get a near black that would go with my ultramarine blue underpainting. I don't mind if some ultramarine blue peeks through, because sometimes very dark shiny hair has a bluish sheen to it. As I'm painting into the flower petals, I don't want them to look too uniform. Where the top of her head and her hair make contact with the background, I want a softer edge, because the background is almost as dark as her hair. I tried mixing some oil with my dark color, because I wanted to let some of the background, or some of the underpainting, I should say, show through, but I didn't like how thin it became. So I kind of went in between. I just used a little teeny bit of oil sometimes just to help it spread better, but I liked it a little bit thicker. Where her hair touches her face, I'm not sure if I like the hard line that's there. I might experiment with softening it when I do more with the skin of her face. I'm just trying to fix the face a little bit. Since the paint on the face is dry, I'm using my pen to mark out and almost more of a mental note, mark what I'm trying to adjust. And I'm just going to use some white to replace some of the lines that got messed up. After I do that, I'm going to focus on adding the greenery, which is quite dark and muted. So for that section, I'm going to add yellow ochre to my black mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And just using a little bit of yellow ochre, it makes a dark green. And if I use more yellow ochre, it makes a lighter green. So I'm just adding smudges around of that dark green first, and then I do the lighter green second, using the photo reference for ideas of where I want to put the lighter green. I also noticed that in the reference photo, her neck has quite a lot of green in it, and so I'm going to end up adding some of my green mixture with white added to her neck. The grass background in the reference photo looks like it has some viridian green in it. So I used the light yellow ochre green mixtures on my palette and added viridian green, just to make it slightly more vibrant. I added my black mixture by degrees as I worked down the canvas to take it darker. Once I finished the grass, I added white to a pretty dark viridian green mixture. Dark meaning it also had a lot of ultramarine blue and a little bit of burnt umber and a lot of white, and that's what I used for the top right corner. I spent some time rereading Alla Prima II by Richard Schmid. If you are thinking about it, buying it, or if you're looking at Alla Prima I, Alla Prima II has the same material, it's just got more. So save your money and just go straight for Alla Prima II. I marked some of my favorite things from the first chapter. I went through the first half, seeing what I like. Probably do the second half in my next video. I want this to be a little bit like my own art journal as well, so that I can look back and appreciate it. But in the introduction, he says some things that I really appreciate, and one of them is, he writes, "I've tried to avoid rules of any kind. If some of my comments sound like rules, I apologize. Please regard them as emphatic suggestions. Painting should be a liberating experience, not an ordeal filled with do's and don'ts." Not an ordeal. That sounds negative. "Bear this in mind too. What I offer is merely what I have learned in my lifetime so far, and certainly not the last word on how to paint. I give you ideas and procedures that work, but that doesn't mean my ways, or any of the techniques of the great masters for that matter, are the only methods or the best." I thought that was pretty remarkable coming from Richard Schmid, who's a master painter. He's been painting for 70 years and he's world-known, world-renowned, that he could be humble enough to say, "I'm telling you what I've learned, but you don't have to do what I do just because I do it. There are no rules. And if I come across that way, I'm sorry. That's not how I'm meaning to come across." And I think that's also really important before I kind of talk about some of his other ideas, to just keep that in the back of your mind. And when I first read this book, I hadn't done a lot of painting yet. And I don't know if I've done a lot now, but I've done a little more, and I can say that there's even one idea that stood out to me that I don't agree with, and not necessarily that it isn't good or helpful to some people, but I just don't think it's helpful for me personally. But I'll share that with you later. In chapter one is called Good Ideas and Free Advice. I'm just going to share a couple of pieces from it that I liked. He says, "Whether you are a professional artist, a student, or you paint just for the sheer enjoyment of it, you ought to be serious about it, at least while you are painting. Please always, in capital letters, always, give it your best shot. Have a warm respect for your art and cherish your affection for it. And never demean, never in capital letters, never demean your efforts because you think you're not in a class with Rembrandt. Paint the things you most deeply respond to and use any legal means necessary to make your work come out the way you intend. That's what Rembrandt did." I like that he says to take each thing we try to do seriously, even if we know it probably isn't good yet. I tend to be a perfectionist and I overdo rather than underdo, so I tend to have to get myself to take a step back, but I still don't want to treat my painting like it's practice, because then I'm just not even motivated to paint at all, to be straightforward. Okay, some things he says about talent I think are really good. He says, "Don't bother about whether or not you have it," referring to talent. "Just assume you do, and then please forget about it. Talent is merely one of those convenient words, like gifted or endowed, that we use after someone has become accomplished. There is simply no way to detect it before the fact, or when someone is still grappling with the learning process. It is impossible to predict when or if mastery will click into place. The only time we can be comfortably sure about high skill is when we finally go to Carnegie Hall and hear our little cousin Charlie play the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto for the second time. The first time might have been an accident." That's kind of like his style of writing through the whole book. It's like he's just your friend talking to you, explaining to you his little nuggets of wisdom. Also about talent, he says, I'm skipping a few paragraphs, "You can learn the skills required for painting in the same way that you learn anything else you're strongly drawn to. I don't mean to underestimate the difficulties, however. The great painters devoted their lives to their art, often to the point of total obsession. Serious painting is not something that can be learned casually. You must be willing to sacrifice many other things. So don't waste time worrying if you are talented. And don't blame any failures on the lack of it. that is the ultimate cop-out. There's a section on learning that he writes. I didn't mark anything noteworthy in that one. It's all noteworthy, but I just didn't mark anything to share in this video. There's a section on failure. I liked his section on your code, and the part I marked says, without mindless imitation, don't be shy about borrowing other artists' good ideas. All artists have done that. It's why we have a vast body of cumulative knowledge from which to draw. Plagiarism, on the other hand, is passing off someone else's work as yours, but learning from their knowledge is an extension of their achievement. The caveat is that if you wish to study the works of another artist, make sure that he or she is competent. Watch out especially for the shortcomings of famous artists. Not everything they did was great art. They too had their bad days. Can you just imagine, like, Van Gogh having his bad days? We sometimes put artists on this pedestal. I find that concept interesting, that even master painters don't just produce a masterpiece after masterpiece. So there's a section on vigilance, on confidence, on guard section, keep it simple, bedrock, finishing, about the process. All this is great ideas and free advice, you understand. Control and detail, painting looseness. I like the looseness section. He talks about that looseness should describe how a painting looks, not necessarily how it was done. So you can put a loose stroke on your canvas with precision. Like, I precisely want my loose stroke right there. This paragraph I took some issue with, and I'll share that. This one, I gotta read that again because I messed up and I skipped a whole line. Okay, wrong. What do I mean by wrong? Wrong is anything on my canvas which doesn't look like what I intend it to look like. I don't mean to suggest that wrong means any deviation from a strictly literal rendering of my subject. On the contrary, wrong as I am using it here means an unintentional swaying away from what I decided to have in my picture. It can be anything from a simple mistake in drawing or color or values to a really ludicrous screw-up. Like the time I painted what even I finally had to admit looked like goat horns on one lovely lady who posed for our Chicago group. The offending brushwork was merely intended to be a fancy background stuff, but alas, I was just not paying attention, even though I knew something was not quite right. Therefore, dear friend, whenever a little bell rings in your head as you put something on your painting that bothers you or does not look true, do not leave it there and go on to something else thinking it doesn't matter. It does matter. And I have found the opposite to be true. I can obsess over one piece of my painting and I will stay there for days and days and hours, and it never looks right. And it's only when I just say it's good enough and I leave it there and go on to paint other areas that in hindsight, I give myself permission to go back and change it again. But in the context of the rest of the painting, I like it just fine and it doesn't need to be changed. I think for my painting personality, this advice doesn't work. Though I think I've practiced doing what he says here and tried to be perfectionist, and it's not that it hurts my painting. I don't think I've ever produced something worse by applying this idea, but it just takes forever when it might have been just a little bit more expressive and even just fine, just to move on, and I can go back to it later if it doesn't look right once I've finished the rest of the painting. But most of the time, it looks great once I've finished the rest of it. Which I'm sure that as I get more practice, there'll be other things that I disagree with him on. But I love this book. I'll keep sharing pieces. One side, the circle, lets you go to our channel and watch other videos or subscribe. And then the rectangle on the other side is to watch a video from another channel that we like. Not ours.